Our studio guest making an appearance today is joining us on a monthly basis, sometimes a bit more frequently if something unique or unusual comes up. Grant Lobes is the Twin Falls County Prosecuting Attorney. I would like to thank you for joining us in the studio today.
Good morning.
We were just talking off air about a couple of legal issues. There was something that I happened to see last week online, and I sent you a link to it. And the heroin epidemic, which we talked about before, has really gotten to the point where it's incredibly out of hand. And I don't know what people in law enforcement or in prosecution are going to do if this thing continues at the pace it's going. We're going to be so overwhelmed in our systems. I don't know how you even begin addressing it all.
Well, I guess just the same way we have before. We've been through this kind of thing before with methamphetamine, of course, and it came up kind of out of nowhere in the mid '90s and dominated and still dominates our law enforcement system to this day. But now we're having to split our time between that and the new heroin, and of course that will require a similar response. We'll have to just increase enforcement and take up more of our time in court and with jail space and prison space and everything else. But it's an alarming thing. We've been seeing it for at least the last 6 months to a year, but it's starting to get really out of hand.
I had a friend who was a police officer in the 1970s and 80s in a pretty good sized city, and he told me, he said that he can recall that work was pretty steady, and he said the mid 80s came along and the crack epidemic hit.
Right.
And he said it totally changed. He said they were dealing with far worse crime, much more violence, and it was related to all of that introduction of that drug. Now, eventually, crack cocaine became somewhat of a secondary. I don't know. I don't hear much about it any longer. But a lot of that, we talked about this before because you have people who are talking about changing the way we sentence people. Had a discussion about that with Randy
Hmm.
Staples on
Hmm.
air yesterday. That was
Well, I
his
missed that. I wish I'd have heard that.
subject of his weekly column. Was that we're going to be looking for alternatives in sentencing and more of that.
Well, there are a lot of people who favor alternatives to holding people responsible for their actions, and that unfortunately has become quite a rallying cry for certain people, um, both in the on the right and on the left. I mean, it's a strange thing where the people that you're tempted to call right wing people and the people that you're tempted to call left wing people join forces on uh, things like legalizing drugs, liberalizing sentencing, emptying the prisons, allowing people to just run around doing whatever the heck they want. And as we talked about before, when we talked about marijuana legislation and the various states around us that have legalized marijuana, um, be careful what you do on these issues because you tamper with these things and you change the way your society looks. You think, well, marijuana is not a big deal. Let's legalize it. Well, go to Denver because that's how your society will look. You think these people are, quote, nonviolent. I don't know how that is determined about drug dealers because they're certainly not that. But you think, let these nonviolent people out. Well, let's see how your society looks when you start doing that. Um, and of course, this whole idea about liberalizing sentencing ignores the facts on the ground. I mean, in order to get a prison sentence, and I'm talking about Idaho, in order to get a prison sentence in Idaho, you don't just get found possessing some marijuana, some methamphetamine, or even necessarily some heroin. I mean, you've got to have a lot of it. You've got to be selling it to people, or it's got to be your second, third, or fourth conviction. If people who are in favor of the liberalizing the way we sentence people went and saw how the courts really worked, um, they either wouldn't have that position or we would know that the reason for it is something other than what they're saying.
And did the sentencing laws that came about in the cocaine epidemic, the aftermath, a lot of federal laws came along. Did
Mhm.
they help snuff that out?
Well, you always hear how we law enforcement are losing the war against drugs, and the evidence for that is, well, look, there's still a lot of drugs. Well, The question I guess we don't know the answer to is, would there be more or less if we just said we don't care and let it just happen? My feeling is that there would be bigger problems if we just, stopped enforcing the laws, or if we decided that no matter what you did, you didn't go to, you weren't incarcerated for violating them. I think that the thought that we can, quote, win the war against drugs is ridiculous. We'll never win if by that you mean eliminate illegal drug use. What we're after in law enforcement is to keep the level of crime to an acceptable level. Keep it down where it doesn't destroy our communities, doesn't destroy the lives of people, and there are always going to be people who are going to violate the law, and there are always going to be people who are going to use illegal drugs. But we want to keep it from becoming the defining characteristic of our community.
I had a chance back during that epidemic with the crack cocaine to take I rode on the campaign bus for a stretch with Al D'Amato, who was one of the big
Hmm.
proponents of these tougher laws. And we would stop at all of these rural shopping plazas on a fall day, and he would get on the back of a trailer and give his stump speech. But every time he would reference tougher drug laws, he got the biggest response when it came to applause. So that was a reaction to people who were sick and tired of this at the time.
Hmm.
And we have people saying, well, times have changed now. It's not crack, it's heroin. But the idea, I guess, would still be the same, that a tough law would keep the dealers off the streets.
Sure, it'll keep some off the streets because some will be in prison. It'll keep others from coming to Idaho because Idaho will look like a bad place to do drug business, especially if you can go to a neighboring state and nobody cares there. Um, that there's an advantage that Idaho now has to being surrounded by states with more liberal
Mhm.
drug laws. And that is, if you're a drug dealer, first of all, there's a relatively small population here. Are you going to risk everything to come to Idaho where they have tougher laws when you can just sell in Utah or Nevada or Oregon or Washington or Colorado and not face the same kind of scrutiny and the same kind of law enforcement emphasis? You'd have to be an idiot, right? And so w- there isn't any logical reason why we look around and say, hey, we have to be as easy on these people and as easy on drugs and as light on sentencing as the people around us. Um, it just isn't well thought out
There was a story
unless
this,
you want your society to look like that. And that's the question that needs to be asked.
and a lot of people out there say, well, live and let live. If somebody wants to
Sure.
be addicted, that's
There are
their
people
choice.
on the far right and on the far left, whether they're ACLU or Freedom Foundation, who want our society to look like Denver, Colorado.
Now, the Times News had the story this week about marijuana in Idaho, and I'm hearing more and more. The reporter, I thought, was dancing down the middle of it. I thought he did a nice job of just presenting. There are people out there who are now saying we've got to have at least the medical marijuana, and more Republicans who were opposed maybe at one time to all marijuana are on board with that change. Is that a slippery slope?
Well, sure it is. And, most of the people quoted in the article, frankly, don't have any idea what they're talking about. And and that's okay. I mean, if I were a state legislator, I would have 3,000 issues that I would have to suddenly be an expert on. I think they need to call some experts though when they're dealing with stuff like this. Um, the comment that, well, we shouldn't put people in jail just for driving through our state. Well, the people that we're putting in jail for driving through our state are the people that have trunks full of marijuana or whatever drugs, but in this case, marijuana. The idea that we should legalize marijuana medicinally, first of all, you don't know exactly what they're talking about when they say that. If they're talking about full on medicinal marijuana use, that gets completely out of hand because if you look at the petition, for instance, that's being circulated, it lists a whole bunch of things that you can use your medicinal marijuana for. And then at the bottom, it says, or anything else. I mean, it's pretty much an open prescription, so to speak, for using it for absolutely anything. I mean, I got a headache this morning. I'm lazy this morning. I'm sleepy. I've got anxiety, my knee hurts, whatever. I mean, there won't be any way to question the use. That petition, in fact, it allows people to have an enormous amount of marijuana. I mean, what we would call trafficking amounts now for personal use. So it's huge amounts. It's not just I can have a joint or two when I want to and smoke it in my backyard and the privacy of my own property. Um, and then you get the question of the governor's veto that keeps coming up, the CBD oil issue, and that is by some of the people that are commenting about medical marijuana seem to be talking about that, but they don't refine their language to the point where you can really know. Labrador's comment, for instance, that's quoted in the article is he's against legalizing marijuana, but he thinks extracts are fine. Well, extracts are often much more potent than the marijuana itself. So we need to, if we're going to talk about this in the public, really refine our language so we know what we're talking about.
We
Um,
have we have a couple of callers. Do you want to take a
Okay.
call?
Let me just make one point, and I certainly want to get to the callers, but the question of CBD oil is not a question of whether anybody thinks it can be used for medicinal purposes. The governor's program, which is hopefully coming to a conclusion soon, and from what I hear, a positive one, the governor said CBD oil may have some value. Let's study it in a clinical setting. Let's make it safely. Let's figure out how much of a dose works for what things. Let's have doctors prescribe it after it's produced by somebody in a clean laboratory. Well, the contrary to that, the people who say, oh no, we want CBD oil legalized, they want me to be able to go home and make it in my bathtub and sell it to you with no strings attached, no regulation, nothing. And that's a dangerous thing. I mean,
That's
which would you
profitable
rather
though.
give your children if they had a seizure? Hopefully, not my bathtub version, because I don't know what I'm doing.
We have a caller, and caller, you're up next. You're on the air with Grant Lobes at 918. Go ahead.
Good morning. I had a question about the drugs that are confiscated when they become evidence. How are they destroyed, and who oversees that to make sure that that's what happens to them? Because there's an incredible value there.
Uh, that's an interesting question. And yes, of course, when the police seize drugs, they do one of two things with them. Either they become evidence in a crime and they're used as evidence, and then they become evidence that the court controls during the time that the case is pending, or they are kept in law enforcement lockers. The law enforcement agencies have special lockers where they keep drug evidence, and at a certain point, usually with a court order to destroy the drugs are destroyed. The law enforcement has checks and balances. There are certain people with keys, certain people with authority to get into these lockers. There are, of course, people who check to make sure what is there, what is said to be there is there, and then at the appropriate time, the drugs are taken out and they're destroyed. Um, Depends on the kind of drug, how it's destroyed, sometimes burning, sometimes other methods.
We have more coming up. I want to thank the caller for chiming in. You can always send the stuff he sees to John Hickenlooper. He'll find a use for it. Somebody out there will get that. 920. It's 47. Grant Lobes is our guest on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX at newsradio1310.com. Bill Colley with you as well till 10 o'clock. Our studio guest, Grant Lobes, is the county prosecutor, prosecuting attorney in Twin Falls County. Bill Colley with you as well this morning on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX at newsradio1310.com. We're at 46, and telephone number to reach the show, 208-736-0300. You referenced Raul Labrador saying that he might be willing to go along with the extract
Well,
that could be
and
used.
again, I don't know what he means by that because
He referenced it here a couple of weeks ago on the
right.
show.
But what if he meant CBD oil? That's one thing. If he meant what is commonly referred to as extracts of marijuana, well, that makes no sense at all. And again, my point is when you talk about this, you have to know what you're talking about, and you have to be careful in your language. And I'm not setting myself up as an expert on all of these things, but with regard to CBD oil, um, it is one type of thing that can be extracted from marijuana. But when you talk about extracts, you're talking about the things like, for instance, you get in the edibles that are for sale.
Mhm.
Butane hash oil is an extract. I mean, these things, the extract term covers a wide variety of things, many of which are many times more potent than just smoking a marijuana cigarette, which, as we all know, is much more potent than it used to be.
His reference was, of course, he's looking to provide medical relief to people who are looking for it as a means of
Mm,
painkiller
mhm.
or cancer
And
patients and the
again,
like.
does he mean marijuana itself or CBD oil, which is at least not has minute or small traces of THC in
And
it?
I understand people use sometimes they just simply in some states they're smoking actual marijuana
Mhm.
cigarettes for the relief of symptoms, medical symptoms.
Yes, if you say I'm in favor of medical marijuana, we know what that means. At least I know what that means. It means that you believe that people should be able to get marijuana cigarettes or marijuana pills and either smoke them or take them and allegedly relieve certain symptoms of certain illnesses. And that's one of the things that we see in like the petition that's going around for medical marijuana, listing all the symptoms and all the things that you can take it for, and then saying, as I said before, and anything else that bothers you. And so that's one thing. But I don't think, from what I've seen, Congressman Labrador say that he's in favor of that. I think he's probably talking about he's in favor of CBD oil, which, if he is, he should be a ardent supporter of Governor Otter's veto of the bill, the very sloppy, dangerous bill that was written a couple years ago, and in favor of the program that Governor Otter put in place. Um, and again, I don't, it's hard to know what people really mean
He,
because they don't
he
know what they're talking about.
the congressman did say that he's opposed to recreational use, so I think that he might be thinking along the lines of what Governor Otter had to say in his statement. Although I saw
But
that
he's against what Governor Otter did. And so I think the responsible people that are against what Governor Otter did don't know what he did. He didn't turn his back on people with children with epilepsy. He said, let's find out if this is really a cure, if it's
mhm,
really effective in treating children. Let's put it through clinical trials, which, of course, any drug you take, you'd want to be put through clinical trials. Let's manufacture it in a safe, clean environment. Let's give it to doctors to prescribe with, appropriate dosage. Don't just get it from the guy on the corner who says, "Hey, I got something in my bag for you here. I made it last night," and give it to you and say, "Oh, good, I'll run home and give this to my child." That's the scary way to do it. The safe way to do it is to test it, find out what it does, and find out how to administer it. And that's what the governor's program does. And why anybody would be against that unless they're in favor of larger legalization, I don't know.
larger legalization. And I got the impression in the Times news story that there are some people out there in government who favor that simply because they look at the revenue, so-called revenue that's coming into
Mm.
Colorado and say, gee, we could use that. And whether they believed it, they may not smoke themselves, they may be opposed to it, but the allure of all of those dollars that they would see seems to
Yeah.
change people's thinking.
Well, a couple things. One, that revenue isn't as great as they say. It isn't as great as predicted, and the overwhelming bulk of it goes to the increased regulation that is required to make marijuana a safe, regulated industry. I mean, if you just take an illegal thing and you say we're going to make it legal and we're going to regulate it and we're going to create a safe industry out of it, that's an incredible expense. And if you look at the expense that Colorado is paying just for the increased regulation of that industry. It's huge. And the marijuana tax profits go largely to that and also to the increased health problems that that state has. But the second thing is, as I said before, when you say we're going to do something to make money for the state, look at what the effect of that is. I mean, if you wanted to legalize casino gambling in Boise, it would make a lot of money for the state. What would it do to downtown Boise, though? It's not just, hey, let's do this and we'll get a lot of money. With the money comes other stuff. And the other things that come with le- legalization of marijuana, you can see readily by going to Denver.
Right.
And again, Denver might be your favorite town. You might like to go there 3 times a week. Fine with me. I'm not saying it is either good or bad, but when you go there, keep in mind that's the way Boise, Idaho is going to look if you do this.
That's a lot of people walking around sort of
Sure.
lost.
Well, yeah, it's radically changed the way downtown Denver is, and again, if that's what your goal is, why don't you just say so? If it's not, then you should maybe rethink the effect of this. You're not just going to get a lot of money.
Governor Rotter said in a small group setting that I happened to be attending last spring that obviously nothing like legalization for recreational use would ever happen on his watch. His watch is coming to an end,
It
but I get
is.
the impression that of the three Republicans who are seeking his office, none of them at this point are in favor of recreational use and wouldn't be at any time.
They certainly say that they're not in favor of it now. And, I don't have any reason to believe that they would be in favor of full scale recreational use. The comments about the medical use, though, are confusing, as I've said. We don't know exactly what is meant by some of these comments.
We've got more coming up with Grant Lobes. He's the Twin Falls County prosecuting attorney, and we're at 45 this morning at 9:30. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Our studio guest is Grant Lobes. He's the Twin Falls County prosecuting attorney. Bill Colley with you as well this morning. And I want to point out you can reach our show at 208-736-0300. We're at 43. We have noted we didn't get a lot of calls from people today. I think we had one show where we talked about marijuana almost exclusively, and we got all the folks out there who were looking for legalization for recreational use, and they didn't get very far that day, so I don't think we're going to hear from a lot of them today. And I think that point has become somewhat secondary, and I think they realize that unless they move, it's nothing that's going to happen here in the state of Idaho. But as we were talking, perceptions can sometimes change, and even public. And a lot of times
Sure.
people in politics, they look at a public mood that changes. And it's almost like sometimes you have an inversion where people say no, 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 and then all of a sudden maybe some big story happens or there's some change culturally, and it's the public opinion changes so dramatically, and then the politicians follow that. And there's always the danger from your perspective that could happen.
Well, for me, it's not a danger. I mean, if the public actually makes an informed choice and wants to change these things, that's up to them. I mean, I work for the public.
Mhm.
I think it's my job, as well as the job of legislators and governors, to try to educate the public. If the people in government have facts that the public might need to make a decision, I think it's their job um, to try to honestly put those forward. But if the citizens of Twin Falls County and the citizens of the state of Idaho decide they want, to legalize marijuana or legalize heroin or whatever, I mean, I hope they inform themselves about what that means before they do it. But if they do it, I follow along because it's my job to enforce the laws that are passed. Um, some of these things are, of course, illegal federally, and so Idaho has um, limited power to make, for instance,
Mhm.
marijuana legal because it's illegal if under federal law. But that can change, and of course, over history, that does change. I mean, obviously, in the 20s, it was illegal to possess and consume alcohol, and certainly to manufacture it, and that changed. And the people that made a living, fighting the use of alcohol had to change, and the next day they didn't do that anymore. So that certainly can happen. I just want to make sure that, as far as I'm concerned, while this issue is still in the air, that people make an informed decision about it. It's not as easy as saying, um, "What's the big deal? It doesn't hurt anybody if I smoke a joint." That may or may not be true, but that's not what happens when you legislate and make it suddenly legal. And again, it changes the way your community looks.
We have a caller. Caller, you're up next. You're on the air with Grant Lobes. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, gentlemen. Thanks for taking my call. I really, really hope they do not pass this marijuana law. You just said that it's only smoking a joint. Well, I'm related to a person that's down in Salt Lake right now going through rehab for the umpteenth time for heroin and that oxycodone stuff. Well, it all started with marijuana. That's where it started. And these kids nowadays, there's such peer pressure. I can't even fathom what they're going through. But to sit here and say we need to legalize it, make it easier for people to get, I don't understand. I mean, we've been basically marijuana free now since the beginning of the country. Other than there was times I guess they used to take stuff, back in the 1800s, that opium, but and they made that illegal. But I just pray that people have brains enough not to do this.
And and want to thank him for the call. The argument I keep hearing is it's not a gateway drug, but everybody you meet who seems to have other serious issues usually started with drinking beer with their buddies and maybe smoking marijuana.
There's all kinds of debate whether it's a gateway drug or not a gateway drug. And I guess the easy answer to that, without going to all the science and arguing, minute points, is that for some people it is, and for some people it might not be. Um, I think the caller talks about people that he knows for whom it was. I certainly see a lot of people in my business for whom it is a gateway drug, and that they started with that. And some of them started with alcohol, went to marijuana, went to something harder. Some of them start with alcohol and they just stay there. Some start with marijuana and they just stay there. But I guess again, it's just not as simple as making it okay to smoke it in your basement. It is a wide-ranging cultural, societal decision, and it affects the way our society is, just as prohibition did and the lifting of prohibition did. Obviously, downtown Boise, downtown Twin Falls, would look different if alcohol were illegal. And so people made a decision that they wanted alcohol to be legal again. And now you have bars and you have, whatever problems there are associated with alcohol abuse. That's a decision that was made. Whether it's right or wrong is a question you can debate, but don't do it and think that it's all in a vacuum. When you make these decisions, you change the way your community looks.
We've got more coming up with Grant Lobes. He's the Twin Falls County Prosecuting Attorney. We're at 9:40, we'll call it, and 44. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story. We've got more coming up. Our guest is Grant Lobes. He's the Twin Falls County Prosecuting Attorney, and Bill Colley with you as well this morning at 9:42. We've got 43, and you're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com, 208-736-0300. And we open this segment with a caller. Caller, you're up next, and you're on the air.
Good morning, guys. Yul Brynner, the late Yul Brynner, before he died of lung cancer, did a commercial, and he said, "Don't smoke."
That's probably applicable to marijuana, too, then, right?
I remember that ad, and it was kind of sad.
We wanted to point out, you can also email me at bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. And you referenced briefly if Boise wanted to open a casino. And I made a couple of trips over to Jackpot and looked over the place there, and you walk into the betting room with all the big football screens.
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted to watch a game, you have to have a knife to cut through the smoking haze. But there will be people in government that will look at what happens in other states and say, well, because revenue is always going to be a huge issue. And the expense of running government doesn't seem to become lessened any year.
Revenue is great. If you can find a way to get it without other consequences, that's great. I mean,
and it looks good when you're talking about legalizing marijuana or
if you
gambling.
Just talk about the cash, it sounds great.
Or even prostitution. And all of these things, though, we were talking during the break, they have a downside in the sense that if you're the neighbor of somebody operating a house of ill repute, you've got people over there at 2 a.m. screaming and yelling and urinating in the grass and all of these things. I know the libertarian view is, look, to each his own, let them do what they want. But who was the justice that said that your right ends at the tip of my nose?
I don't remember.
But there was the line that was made famous. And that's part of the problem here is that the neighbor doesn't seem to have a say in all of this, who keeps getting, he's trying to get some sleep at 2 a.m. and somebody yelling outside keeps waking him up.
Because, it's an attractive theory, and I say it has some attraction for me. The idea that, if I'm not bothering anybody, leave me alone to do what I want to do. But the problem is it's not as simple as that. You may be bothering other people, or you may require a change in the law that changes everything, like I've been saying. And one of the great things about Idaho, and some people think it's a bad thing, but one of the great things about Idaho is it's kind of slow, it's kind of deliberate, it's kind of behind the times a little bit. And when we're behind something that's really exciting and great, that's too bad. I mean, I wish we'd catch up a little. But when we're behind something that's controversial and troubling and has all kinds of complexity, it gives us an opportunity to sit back and just watch. I mean, if your neighbor puts in the $15,000 sprinkler system and it's going to be remote controlled and everything, and you're stuck with turning your water on every night, wait to see if his works before you go buy one. And if your neighbor to the south and to the north and to the west legalizes marijuana, um, wish him well. Watch to see how it works. Learn from his mistakes before you rush in and do it, and see if 5 or 10 years down the road when you visit that state, that's the way you want Idaho to look. Because, we're surrounded by people who are trying this, and they are going through enormous problems, both financially and, as far as their healthcare system, as far as their law enforcement. And why don't we wait to see them figure that out if they do? Um, you know, the governor of Colorado is not out urging Governor Otter to legalize marijuana,
In
and
fact, I guess he's told Governor
he
Otter there have been
has
some downsides.
absolutely said, "Don't do it if you can help it." And again, what's the harm of watching and seeing?
We want to point out you can reach the show today at 208 736 0300. That's called my cough button in action, by the way, for just a moment. We mentioned sports betting and or casino gambling. That's one of the cases going before the Supreme Court this term. New Jersey would like to have more sports betting to prop up its casinos along the boardwalk in Atlantic City, which when they opened these in 1976, they said it was going to be the savior for New Jersey, and it turns out it didn't change things. You walk 2 blocks from the casino, you need a bodyguard.
Yeah.
Uh, but now the latest is, well, if we just add this, it'll be better. Um, they're using the 10th Amendment, saying that this should really be a state decision. Do you agree with that? That's something that, and it's called Christie, by the way. Even though he's governor, I'm not sure he's involved in the lawsuit.
Well, I mean, we'll see what the court says about that. I mean, there's a law that prohibits it, and the state of New Jersey wants to change that. New Jersey is a state which already has casino gambling, and from what I understand, they want to have the sports book in the casinos, not in cities that don't have casino gambling. So it is a fairly limited thing as far as what New Jersey wanted to do. What the decision, however, will mean if the court decides that that law is to be overturned based on the 10th Amendment, then that'll open up, any other place to do the same thing. Um, I don't know. It's a tough question. I mean, whether the federal law should prohibit that or whether it should be up to states, I generally say it should be up to states. That's just my personal opinion. But that's the issue that's clashing on that particular case. I think if New Jersey wants to have sports book gambling in their casinos, I mean, I don't care. I think that if it were a issue of whether we did it in Idaho, I'd have a question about that. I'd have an opinion because it would be my state, but New Jersey's not my state.
The thing is Nevada's been doing it for a long, long time, and if you can permit somebody to do it, and I think Delaware has a limited sports book that they do, but if you can permit some states, it seems to me that federal government would have a difficult argument in denying the other 48.
Sure. And it's a grandfathered in kind of a deal, I guess. But that's just one way of saying, yeah, that state gets to keep doing it.
One of the other cases coming before the court is a fellow who's challenging. Apparently, police were checking his cell phone activity. There was a story out a few years ago about a guy in Germany who got on a train and rode 300 miles. Later discovered that his smartphone, pings every few hundred feet. So if someone wanted to track his whereabouts, they just had to follow the record of the cell phone. And apparently, the argument is that this somehow violates unreasonable search. And I think the
To
argument,
do it without a warrant.
right,
Yeah.
and yet we don't realize that we're walking around with these devices that allow the tracking of us almost to every few hundred feet wherever we're going.
Yeah, sometimes not. I mean, a lot of people don't want to be tracked, of course, by law enforcement either, but some of the people that are tracking you and monitoring your whereabouts and your activities on the cell phone are a lot more nefarious than law enforcement.
Mhm.
And yeah, I think people have really no idea what power they give other people when they carry these smartphones.
I happened to be in a store yesterday, and noticed that my Wi-Fi had picked up the store's Wi-Fi, and a warning came up saying it wasn't private. So if I open up my email, someone else can read my email, is what it's telling me. You have all of those things going on, but it seems to me that the concern here is that government will someday become all powerful, like Big Brother, and that it'll be able to
Or
track every
like
movement
Google.
you make. Or
Yeah.
Google, right?
Yeah, I mean, if our government was as powerful as Google, we'd be terrified.
Yeah,
Because Google, of course, knows what you're doing whenever you're doing it.
if
If
you
you,
voluntarily give it
yeah,
to them.
if you voluntarily give them this information, they use it for whatever they want to use it for.
And people don't know that Facebook, if you're looking at it keeps an algorithm of what you're looking at. So if your interest is politics, they sell you political advertising. If your interest is sports, they sell you sports
Yeah.
advertising.
And there are some of these applications that people can use to find out where you are at any given split second. I mean, you can see people you're talking to walking through the mall, and you can see whether they're in Penny's or Sears, and you can know exactly where they are at that given moment, and that's kind of scary.
I happened to be at a football game in Boise last year, and I was sitting in the stands and pulled out my smartphone, and it told me somebody I knew, he was a lobbyist for the Second Amendment in Boise, told me where he was sitting, and
Yeah.
so I texted him and said, "Hey, I'm waving to you," and he wrote back and said, "Where are you?" But that it gave it up. It told me exactly where he was sitting. And just the other day, I was sitting in my living room and I got a little bloop on the phone, and I picked it up, and it told me that the sheriff's wife was about a mile away. That Denise was shopping somewhere in the neighborhood, apparently. And I don't think people, even in law enforcement, sometimes or their families, are aware that this information is going out there.
Yeah. Well, and that's scary to me. I mean, I've got two children, and the thought that people can track them wherever they are and see where they're standing in line at, Smith's to buy groceries and see them walk into their car, that's scary stuff. And if you like that, great. But people should learn what is going on with these things and opt in or out of these programs that do that. And I think a lot of times you just pick up the phone, start using it, and you don't even know.
But we are much more suspicious of government without realizing. And most of your friends don't mean you any harm, but there could be people out there if they see that.
Well, and the problem, especially with teenagers and school age kids, is a lot of their friends aren't friends. I mean, if you have a child of that age, you would know that there's a lot of competition to have, the most Facebook friends or the most whatever program friends. And look at me, I've got 28 more friends than my friend has. Well, do you really know all those people? Because a lot of the people that you know are friends of friends of friends of friends. And of course, in my business and in law enforcement, we know that a lot of those people are predators who are looking to take advantage of you either financially or with children sexually. So, who is really tracking these? I mean, if you have 600 Facebook friends, are they really your good friends? Do you really know who those people are? Um, if you do, good for you. You've got a lot of good close friends. I don't have 600 people that I would want to know where I am every day, every minute of the day, and what I'm doing and what my kids are doing.
There are so many of these services, though, even the ones that seem legitimate. White Pages comes to mind, and some of these other computer services. I can type somebody's name in there, and it used to be it was all free, and now I think you have to pay fees for certain details. But you will get phone numbers,
Hmm.
sometimes addresses, and so if someone is trying to track you down,
Hmm.
it's fairly simple for them to do it in the computer age.
Oh, absolutely. And it's very easy for somebody who means you harm to put information about you out on the internet. I mean, I've had that happen to me. I've had, and I know a lot of people, who I deal with in a professional relationship, victims of crime, have that kind of stalking and malevolent behavior by people who take pictures of them or, take pictures of your car and put it out there so the people that mean you harm know what you're driving today. It's alarming.
I had a listener some years ago. who was going around to various businesses and impersonating me, and then he would say outlandish things while he was at the businesses, and then he would go back and brag about it on social media. His mistake was a state legislator saw it and called state police. Now, I don't think they could arrest him, but they could tell him to cool his behavior, which he ended up doing. But these are the things that we have, and police officers tell me that the number of just simple harassment charges
Hmm.
have skyrocketed with the rise of social media.
Oh, absolutely.
A lot more arrests and people in court because of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just an easy, almost thoughtless way that somebody who's in a bad mood with a bad attitude and bad intentions can mess with you, because it takes 2 seconds. It's like the difference between sitting down and writing a letter to somebody, telling them what a dirty sob they are, and sending them a text. The text, there's no time for my brain to override my emotion. The text is gone, and at the letter, it takes me a while, and I write it, and then I have to walk to the mailbox and mail it. But everything is instant now, and
That's
that
that
for the bad guys as well as the good guys.
we've talked about this before. That's that situation where you have a young couple, boyfriend and girlfriend, and they get into an argument. He goes home, he has a six pack, and then he gets angry and he types something nasty. And the next morning, he's got a visitor from the sheriff's department. Well, in the old days, you would have said go home and cool off, but the computer makes it so easy to do it in instant time. There's no room, as you say, for thinking about all of this.
Yeah, yeah. It's technology is great when it's helping you, but people need to keep in mind it can also make it very easy to hurt you.
Wanted to point out Grant Loebs is our guest in the studio this morning. He's the Twin Falls County prosecutor, and if you're joining us, I do want to point out as well, Rush Limbaugh's program is coming up after news. About a minute to go. We didn't get to everything today. Quick note: Paul Manafort. The rumor is he's going to be indicted. He was on the Trump campaign. Uh, there's some discussion that he'll be indicted in New York State versus a federal indictment because that way the president can't pardon him. That somebody's already thinking this through, that the president might just step in with a pardon. Do you think there's any truth to that?
Well, there's truth to the fact that the president can pardon him if he's prosecuted for a state crime, and maybe Trump tipped his hat that he's preparing to pardon his friends and people who he agrees with when he pardoned the sheriff in Phoenix. But who knows? I mean, that shouldn't be the decision of the prosecutor. The prosecutor shouldn't be thinking about how to prosecute somebody so as to avoid pardons in the future. But this is obviously a prosecution with enormous political overtones. It's not just somebody looking at the statute.
Want to thank Grant Loebs, and we'll see you again sometime in October.
Yeah.
We want to point out Rush Limbaugh, as I mentioned, coming up after news. Sean Hannity at 1 o'clock this afternoon, Glenn Beck at 4, Dave Ramsey at 7 o'clock tonight, and God willing, the Creek Don't Rise. I'll be back here tomorrow morning between 8 and 10 o'clock on KLIX.